Now, in our study of the intertestamental period last Friday night, we have come to a new topic on page 5 under Judaism, which is C, Samaritanism. Anytime we come to a new topic in an area like this, it's always time to take notice, because if for some reason you've gotten behind or you haven't completely understood some other thing that we've said or some other subject matter such as Hellenism, then when it's not connected, as it really will not be, to the next subject, Samaritanism here, you can always start fresh, and that way you're not too discouraged if you haven't been able to follow or keep up somewhere else. With Samaritanism, we're going to stay a lot more in the Scriptures because we have a lot more in the Bible that actually speaks on that. We did with Hellenism in the book of Acts, but that was toward the end of the study, as you'll remember, not the very beginning of it. There's a lot to say here concerning Samaritanism. We started off last week saying why I think that it's a subject that's somewhat familiar, fairly familiar as a matter of fact, to a lot of people, because of the importance of a couple of passages in the Gospels, John 4 with the woman at the well, and Luke 10, the parable of a certain Samaritan. We looked at a couple of the views as to the origin of the Samaritan people. And so I think what I want to do, I was supposed to say a lot more last time, and I didn't get that in. So we're going to come back to the question, who were the Samaritans, or who are the Samaritans? I've given you 4 different views of who the Samaritans are, but I just gave you the view and summed it up in a sentence or two. What we want to do is take a little more time looking at these options as to the origin of Samaritanism and see which one is true. Now let's maybe start in reverse order. This was the order I gave you last time: the Samaritan view, the Jewish view, Josephus' view, and the view of higher criticism. So let's reverse those and start with higher criticism. I said that their view was that Samaritanism represents a break-off or a division from Judaism which occurred in the intertestamental period, the post-exilic period, the Greek period between 300 and 200 B.C. So all you need to have down there is essentially what I just said. As far as the correctness of this view, well, of course, it's not correct, so we won't spend a lot of time with it. The critical scholars outdo themselves, as I think I ended with saying, by trying to date everything as late as possible. And it's easy whenever you read critical scholarship to see how rabidly biased they are, that they really don't deserve a fair hearing. And I'll say why. It's because they don't give the facts of history, let alone the facts of Scripture, a fair hearing. And so anyone who isn't fair does not deserve to be treated with fairness. That's my opinion of critical scholarship. They are rabidly anti-Christ and biased. And they're at pains to disprove history. They're at pains to disprove Scripture. They're at pains to disprove inspiration. They're at pains to disprove miracles. And we know these things according to the Word of God, the living God who cannot lie, to be true, then because they've attacked the Word, and not just the Word, but simple things like the origin of Samaritanism. With such unfairness, they don't deserve to be treated in any other fashion than just that. So I don't have anything else to say. They're wrong in their theories, as they generally are. And secondly, let's come to Josephus' view. His view was that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah really catalog the origin of Samaritanism. And Josephus is wrong because he doesn't go early enough, as we will be able to show. Josephus is wrong because he does not go early enough. He sees tension in those post-exilic books, Ezra and Nehemiah, and with their contemporaries, Haggai and Zechariah, perhaps Malachi around that time or a little later. But the tension actually goes back much, much further in Israel's history. Now, if we kept going in reverse order, the next view to discuss would be the Jewish view. But rather than do that, I'd like to go back to number 1, and that is the Samaritan view. So we've done them now in the order of 4, 3, 1, and then 2. Now, we would like to say that any people would be the best authority as to their own history. And that's true as long as you're not biased concerning your own origin. And it's possible not to be if you're just telling the facts. If you've got something to prove, if you've got some bone of contention, and if we can detect what that bone of contention is, then we may be a little suspicious of the claim that any person or people should be the best authority for their own origin or history. The Samaritans do in fact have a bone of contention. They do in fact have something that they're arguing for. It's not just straight history. And so that casts suspicion, in my mind, on their view of their own origin. But what I don't think any of you do know is the Samaritan view of their own origin. So let me give that to you. It'll take a little while. I don't know how long tonight. That's why I don't know how far we'll go. And this is something that is extra biblical in the sense that this is Samaritan history. This is what the Samaritans say is their own history. And so you may never have heard of this before. And this may be one of maybe a couple of things in Samaritanism that you're not familiar with. Even though I praised the church in general last week, the whole church in general, for knowing a lot about Samaritans because of John 4 and Luke 11. Or Luke 10, rather. So here's what they have to say. They claim to be the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. And they claim that they're priests. They have their own priestly line, liturgy, holy book. Ended up with their own temple. I mean, an exact, almost, counterpart to Old Testament Judaism. They claim to be the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, and their priests, the descendants of Levi. Now, Ephraim and Manasseh were the two sons of Joseph, so they're claiming, in essence, to be the descendants of Joseph, the 11th son, Benjamin being the final and 12th one. And they're priests who have descended from Levi. Now, if you remember back in the Pentateuch, in Deuteronomy 27, as a matter of fact, it's found other places, I think in chapter 11, but Deuteronomy 27 and then chapter 28 is just an expansion, a part of 27. Well, no, it's really an expansion of the whole thing because you've got the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy 28. But in Deuteronomy 27, Moses told the people, that is a rehearsal of the law in preparation for their crossing from the plains of Moab over the Jordan River to take Jericho, to take the land, to begin the process of dividing the land, a divide and conquer military strategy where you strike at the middle, then attack the north, and attack the south. So it's a divide and conquer strategy. Anyway, I say too much sometimes. I think of too much. I need to stay with what my notes tell me to say. Deuteronomy 27. Maybe if we turn there, then I won't be tempted to go somewhere else. What I want to get to is the fact that Moses told the people, whenever you go into the land, you're going to put the blessings on one mount and the curses on another, evil and Gerizim. Representatives of the people would be on both mounts, and the majority of the people, they couldn't all climb up the mountainside, would be in the valley below. Let me see. We need verse 12. These will stand upon Gerizim to bless the people. Verse 13. And these shall stand upon Mount Ebal to curse. And so in Joshua chapter 8, in obedience to Moses and the Pentateuch, Joshua established the area of Mounts Ebal and Gerizim as a place of importance for the newly established covenantal-based people. Joshua 8, verses 32 through 35. Verse 30 through 35. He's obeying Moses and the Pentateuch, establishing the area of these two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, as a place of initial religious importance for the new nation. Now, all of this is true so far, according to history. This is according to the Samaritan view of their own origin, as well as according to the Bible, as we can see. And then by implication, the place which existed between these two mountains, that is, the city of Shechem, would be a very important religious center, because Shechem was in the valley in between the two mountains. Now let me just show you this ahead. So you can see what we're talking about for those of you that don't know all of the details here, that you don't remember all. Thank you. Okay, if you can see down this low, here they would have come, the plains of Moab, Shittim, and here's Jericho. They would have crossed over the Jordan River here at Jericho, and this was where they were to go. Now, they end up attacking Ai and some other places on the way. But as you see, here's the town of Shechem, represented by a black dot. To the north is Mount Ebal, and to the south is Mount Gerizim. And I've been there. Jacob's Well is right here in Shechem. And you can stand here in Shechem and see the tops of both of these mountains. Now in Israel, mountains aren't like if you were raised out in the west, in this country, in the Rocky Mountains or something. They're just hills like you find around here. But they're called mountains. Oh, like Ebal's 2,700, Mount Gerizim's 3,000, something in that area, 2,000 to 3,000 feet. And you actually can have people down here in the valley between and see and hear what's going on these two hills, or two mountains, because they're so close to one another. All right, so there's a geographical situation of what the Samaritans would claim as to their own origin. Yes?
Well, this is kind of on the side, but
that's fine. We have all the time in the world.
Like that?
Pardon?
Do they have like monuments of events that happened in Israel, like they have, statues and things like that in this day?
Well, they don't have to put up one of those little roadside marble markers or something. They've got Jacob's Well still there. That is the monument. But in that sense, yes, they have some, from the modern state of Israel, some little newly made markers. But for the most part, they've got the original things in Israel. So there's no sense in having to put up any markers. The same is true all over that part of the world. You still got the temples. You still got the shrines. That is your marker there. Jacob's Well now, you see, because the city, Shechem, has been built up and built up and built up, it's about, 30 feet underground now. That's because of the cities were built on top of cities, over the last, 4,000 years. And so the only way we got to Jacob's Well was you go in a little door and you bend way far over, and it's a steep, steep decline of stairs way down into the heart of the earth, and there's the well. Well, in those days, certainly you didn't climb down like that. I don't find Jesus and that woman climbing down in that hole. It's just a hole big enough for a couple of people down there. And that there they are. No, that would have been on the top of the ground, and people from all sides would flock to it. But it's not that way anymore. But they have, and that's one of the things that's fairly official as far as the archaeologists can tell, that is Jacob's Well. That's a moving experience, to say the least, to be at any of those places in the biblical world. There are no other wells around there. I mean, by virtue of the fact Jacob's Well was called Jacob's Well, it was named after the patriarch. It was a very important well. People are going to know where that is. That's going to be maintained century after century after century. Not with any marker. It's just, everyone knows what it is. And if you're from overseas like we would be, then your tour guide knows where it is. So there's not a big name like McDonald's Golden Arches or a big well sign out front or something. No, you would never, if you didn't know what's going on, you'd never find it. There are no signs anywhere. You just wander around in the city. Nothing's labeled at all. And much of that which is labeled in Hebrew, so you wouldn't be able to read that, Hebrew and Arabic. Okay, back to, you can flip that off if you will for right now. We'll come back to it. Thank you. Back to the Samaritan view then. Now the reason we're pointing out these two mountains these are the mountains that become important to the Samaritans. Now it's Zion down here in Jerusalem that becomes important to the Jews. We see their whole argument's going to be, wait a minute, you're violating the very Pentateuch, the very law of Moses. He said that the blessings and the curses wouldn't be down in Jerusalem. There's no mention of Jerusalem anywhere in the Pentateuch as far as a place that would be important. Mounts Ebal and Gerizim are the important places. And so the Samaritans say, see, we have Scripture on our side. And the Jews are the apostates who have perverted the truth. They migrated down south and built their religious shrine on Mount Zion. See, that's why that's important. I trusted you already knew that. Maybe you didn't know. Well, let's go on a little further. Now, during the period of what the Jews call the judges, the Samaritans call them kings, by the way. It doesn't really matter for our purpose right now, but they don't call them judges, they call them kings, which followed Joshua's death. And according to the Samaritans, the last one was Samson. Now, the reason they don't call them judges is because they see this period as a wicked period. I mean, truly it was, but a sign of the apostasy of Israel away from the true religion which the Samaritan people maintained. At the end of this period, that we call judges, that they call kings, the high priest in Israel was one Uzzi, U-Z-Z-I, age 23. Now here's where we go outside of Scripture. They take some of Scripture and then twist the Scripture and get their own meaning. The high priest in Israel at the end of the period of the kings, i.e. judges, was Uzzi, who was 23, and Eli, age 60, was director of revenues and tithes. Uzzi was the high priest as a young man, age 23. Now that's unlikely that you're going to have a man who's 23 as high priest in Israel. But Eli is kind of the important one. He's the elder of the two, although he's not the high priest, age 60. He's director of revenues and tithes. All right, now here's the scenario they draw. Eli becomes very, very rich through his office. And he becomes jealous of young Uzzi because Eli doesn't have the high priesthood. And you see, we see Eli, the man, in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel. But he's not exactly according to this picture that I'm giving you now. Some of this is true. Certainly some type of corruption is entering into Eli and his family. But it seems in 1 Samuel to be more directed toward his two sons rather than toward himself. And so this is what Eli does then. You see, he's rich, he's got the money, but he doesn't have the religious prestige because he doesn't control the high priesthood. And so Eli becomes a magician, practices magic on Israel, seduces a large number of the people to apostatize from the faith of Moses. And he and his followers, now you have to get all this down because you won't find this in the Old Testament. He and his followers then pack up and they move to Shiloh. Now, in the Samaritan view, I'm going to ask you a question here. Who would Eli and all these people represent then? Jews, Israel. Here's what's happening to the nation of Israel. They've been seduced by Eli. He turned himself into a magician, practiced sorcery and magic against them, seduced all the Jews away from Uzzi, who was the true high priest. Seduced most of Israel, by the way, large number, the large number. More follow than don't him, to Shiloh, and there they set up a rival religion and a counterfeit ark and tabernacle. And then God told Uzzi to place all of the true instruments, of the tabernacle, the furniture, the tables, the spoons, the lampstand, all of this, God told Uzziah to place all of the instruments of the tabernacle, all of its furniture, in a cave near Shechem, which was then, this kind of reads similar to the account in 2 Maccabees, by the way, which was then miraculously closed a couple of days later. Supernaturally, earthquake or something, but caused by God. And the rocks came down, and it was sealed, and no one knows where it is. Not to be opened or revealed until Messiah comes. Now, do you remember us discussing something? This is not the same story, but something similar to this in biblical literature, looking at books of Maccabees. It's always been a question for the Jewish people whenever Nebuchadnezzar came over, what happened? Of course, you've got the temple, and you're not dealing with tabernacle anymore, but you've still got the Ark of the Covenant, though. What happened to the Ark? What happened to everything? Well, someone invented a neat little story that Jeremiah went and hid it all somewhere. He was the prophet who stayed behind. He didn't get taken over to Babylon. Remember, he had his choice. You can go to Babylon or stay behind. He chose to stay. Babylon gave him his choice. And the people of Judah didn't give him a choice. They said, you're going with us to Egypt. And they took him with them to Egypt, both him and Baruch. That's a different story, but it's very similar. Something about the furniture of the tabernacle being mysteriously hidden, miraculously closed up, not to be revealed until Messiah comes back. And I think the Jewish people, whether you're of the Samaritan order or a full Jewish person, because of the importance of things like the Old Testament furniture and the tabernacle and temple, you would want to have some story to explain it. Remember, the cry in Jeremiah's day was the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They thought that was so sacred it could not be violated. That was the house of God. That was the abode of God. God could simply not allow the Babylonians to come in and to destroy it. And he did, showing them that he's not bound by places like that. And so, the place is destroyed, but at least we can concoct this story now of the miraculous hiding and preservation of the important temple furniture and instruments. Most importantly, in that group, of course, would be the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the story goes on and on and on, and you have to go through the rest of the Old Testament with their view, weaving everything back and forth. I can't go into all of those details, but let me just kind of sum up some of what they say. Eli taught Samuel how to practice sorcery. Everything from Samuel on, you see, is perversion in the Old Testament, or from Eli on, because of Eli's jealousy of Uzziah. That everything from Eli through Samuel, through Saul, of course, and they can prove it. They say, look at Saul. Look how wicked he was. Look at David and his sin. Well, David, he's got some good points, as they'll say. And look at Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Solomon, the division of the kingdom. And look at what happened. And Assyria came in, and Babylon came in. And then they think they've got good proof, saying that's the wicked people there. They're not the true people. We're the true people. That's a very strong, convincing argument for people that want to believe that way. And, of course, if you're a Samaritan, you'd like to believe that way. So Eli taught Samuel how to practice magic. He bewitched the people even further. Samuel appointed wicked Saul as king to further the apostasy of the people. And if you ask them, well, where does it say that? They say, well, just read 1 Samuel. Look how wicked Saul was. Twice disobeyed God. God finally took the kingdom from him. Of course, they can't answer all your questions. If you say, well, where does it say Samuel practiced magic on anyone? Well, they can say at least this. Remember that time that he brought all the people out into the field, and it was the harvest time, which meant it wasn't time for rain, and he says, now stand and behold the power of God. And what happened? The thunders came, and the wind blew, and, well, he was a sorcerer. He's the one who brought all of that. And he wanted to keep the people on his side, keep their allegiance in his favor, so that no one would suspect Uzziah or someone good and go to the wrong side, in their opinion. And then David comes next. Now, they say that David was a good man. That he was a good man. He started to build the temple down in Jerusalem. Remember how he started to build it? But what happened? Why didn't David finish? Well, a Samaritan prophet named Nathan was sent to him and told him not to build the temple, and explained to him that he had been seduced into thinking that Jerusalem was the important religious area. The Samaritan prophet said that Gerizim was the only allowed place for a temple. And so David, because he was basically a good man, although he was under the influence of deception practiced by Samuel. Samuel anointed him, remember, so he anointed him with a little white magic too. He refrained from building it because he didn't want to sin. But then he died, and his wicked son Solomon followed in his stead, and he was so wicked that he decided to build a temple in Jerusalem anyway. You see how they twist the evidence there? Just enough of the Old Testament to prove their view. Because Solomon was bad. David did refrain. A prophet was sent to him, said don't build. Now they add in to say it was a Samaritan prophet, and he told him don't build because they have to build at Gerizim. And you trace that from Solomon right on through the fall of the northern kingdom, fall of the southern kingdom. It all culminates in whom they call accursed Ezra. Whenever they mention Ezra, they always have the ACC word with it, accursed Ezra. Why is Ezra so accursed? Well, because he canonized all the false notions about Israel in the Old Testament books. See, some of the Jews believe that Ezra had some type of hand in the collecting of the books for the final canon of the Old Testament. And so that's why Ezra is particularly accursed, because he wickedly gathers together false Jewish writings, 1 Samuel through Malachi. False Jewish writings, puts them all together, gives his stamp of approval of Jews in Jerusalem, which tends then to discredit the Samaritan theory or view of their own origin. Now, of course, if we believe the Old Testament narrative, we couldn't possibly accept this story that I just told you. It is a fanciful delusion. So then we might ask, well, how did it all come about? I mean, how did the Samaritans, or what caused them, or when, I guess all of the above questions, did all of this take place? Well, let me give you a little of the history of that. And then you'll understand what I'm going to say now more later when I give you what I think is the correct view for the origin of the Samaritan people. Remember, they're important because Jesus is always dealing with them in the Gospels. And he puts them on a level of importance higher than Gentiles, because he said Jerusalem and Judea first, then Samaria, then out to the Gentile world. There are Jews, there are Gentiles, and somewhere in between, in the Son of God's own estimation, in his heart, in his emotions and feelings, were the Samaritan people. So I'm not downplaying the Samaritan people. They're lying when they tell us this story here. But they do have Jewish blood in them, and that's why the order is given as it is in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. In the heart of the Son of God, those people were ahead of Gentile people. Jews first, then Samaritans, then to the Gentile world. So here's how I would explain how these theories and delusions came about. When the Samaritan people finally reached the point of the development of their own separate identity, which would be about the 2nd century B.C. Now that sentence is important. I'll say it again. Whenever they finally reached the point of the development of their own separate identity, about the 2nd century B.C. Now, it's been going on all along, but this is the final point of completely separate identity. And that's particularly seen in the actual building of their first temple during this century, 2nd century B.C. Then they had to rearrange history in order to validate their claim. That's not done until the 2nd century B.C. They had to then rearrange history to validate their claim to be the true people. And, of course, this is seen in a very obvious scissors and paste approach to the Old Testament. Now, they conveniently enough reject all of the Old Testament except the Pentateuch. Because you see, the whole Old Testament, with the exception of the Pentateuch, would sink their theory. I mean, they believe that everything from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, right on through the Old Testament is a corruption. It represents sorcery being practiced on the people. That they now think that the important thing to do and the important part of Israel is Jerusalem, Mount Zion, and the temple should be built down there. And so it's very convenient then for them to simply reject all of that. And they reject it after they already have their own theories, because that doesn't fit their theory. Now, not only is this scissors and paste approach seen with regard to how they deal with things from like Joshua to Malachi, it's seen actually in the Pentateuch, as we shall see later also. But what about their claim way back at the beginning, because this is the crux of the matter, to be the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh? They established true worship at Shechem. Eli seduced the people and forced them to migrate to Shiloh. Well, if you turn over to 1 Samuel, we do see the people led by Eli from that area. I visited that down in my little museum. I can put a plug in for my museum. Again, I've got actual bullets that were fired during the Civil War at the Battle of Shiloh. So I know something about that battle. That's what brings it to my mind. Probably no one else thought about that. Well, of course it's Shiloh, Israel. Of course it's not Shiloh, Tennessee. Well, of course you're right, so let's continue. 1 Samuel 1:3, and this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And who's the important leader during this time? Eli. 1 Samuel 1:3, they got a text for it there. 1 Samuel 3:21. Now remember, Eli then practices magic on Samuel. All right, and where is Samuel appearing? 1 Samuel 3:21, the Lord appeared again in Shiloh. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. You see, this is the crux of their whole theory here, is that Eli comes in, deceives the people away from Shechem, and establishes them in Shiloh. Well, here's the problem, though. Biblically, with that theory, there is no record of Eli being responsible for the sanctuary's relocation at Shiloh. You see, they're saying that Eli was the one responsible for that. I mean, that's part of their whole theory. He, because of his jealousy for Uzziah, who doesn't even appear in the Old Testament, by the way, seduced the people away from Shechem to Shiloh. Well, there's no record of Eli being the one who's responsible for the establishment of the sanctuary and the tabernacle at Shiloh. By the way, and if you'll turn over to Joshua, I'll show you what I mean by this, and I want to say something going over there. The Old Testament has some, in this period, the period between the conquest of the land and the monarchy, about 300 years. The Old Testament has some gaps in its information as to where the sanctuary is at various given times, when it came there, and why it was moved. For instance, this business of being at Shiloh, we have silence in the Old Testament regarding this. I mean, didn't we just see in Joshua 8, verses 30 through 35, that the people of Israel have established themselves at Shechem? They're at the place between the mounts Ebal and Gerizim. They're at Shechem. Well, we don't know how long they're here, and nothing says that they establish a religious shrine or something here, that this becomes the official place and the only official place for the tabernacle, for the sanctuary. What we have is the plastering of the stones, according to Deuteronomy 27, and a writing of the law upon those stones. It's a temporary experience. And then the Old Testament is silent. The book of Joshua is silent as to when they make their next move to the next place, how long they stay there, why they move. We're not told. There are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of silent periods as you try to work your way from their entrance into the Promised Land all the way down to the monarchy, where we see David establishing the capital in Jerusalem and the sanctuary there, not the temple, but the tabernacle, which has been carried now for several hundred years. A portable tabernacle, and that's why it was portable. Wanderings in the desert, and now you've got 300 years between conquest and monarchy, and it's being moved around all the time. But the Samaritan claim is that Eli is the one who leads them away from Shechem to Shiloh. Well, we have one verse, Joshua 18:1, that disproves that. I mean, Eli's not even born back in these days. Joshua 18:1. We don't know who did it. We don't know why it was done. We don't know when it was done. But the fact of the matter is, between Joshua chapters 8 and 18, that's easy to remember, 2 8s, 8 and 18, the sanctuary is moved from Shechem to Shiloh. Eli's not the one responsible for doing that. Shiloh represents apostasy to the Samaritans. So I'll say that again, between chapters 8 and 18. The tabernacle, the sanctuary is moved from Shechem to Shiloh. We don't know why it's done, when it's done, or who does it. I mean, it's under the leadership of Joshua, but that's all we know. We don't know if it's his idea, priest's idea, Levite's idea, God's commandment to them. We're simply not told. And since Eli is not even on the scene at this time, you've got to finish out the book of Joshua, go through 300 years of the book of Judges before Eli is even born. Eli couldn't be responsible for the move. See, they attach apostasy to the thought of the sanctuary being at Shiloh. And if that's true, then Israel is apostate way back in the days of Joshua. And the Samaritans never claimed that. Joshua 18:1. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. Joshua 18:1. That's an important verse concerning Samaritan delusion. Joshua 18:1. I mean, I've got Shiloh, I did this years ago, colored in big red letters here because I knew it's important because you don't have a lot of information in Joshua as to when things are being moved. You don't even have it said, by the way, in Joshua 8 that they actually set the tabernacle up there and started doing anything for any lengthy period of time. It's just silence. They go, plaster the stones, in obedience to Deuteronomy 27, write the law, more or less of it upon it, the stones, and that's all you have. But Joshua 18:1 is not in unclear terms. It is very clear. The whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. Now you see they've already divided the land between a couple of the tribes, and they've still got 7 tribes to go. And that's what chapter 18 through the end of the book finishes out then. Okay, if you understand that well enough, we'll go on. That's a Samaritan view of their own origin. Cannot be supported, basically, because of Joshua 18:1. Even if we allow them just to discount everything from Samuel on, you've still got to deal with the period of Joshua, which is a transition period. And even if they want to disallow everything from Joshua on, we'll show you later how they rearranged some things actually in the Pentateuch, which is the only part of the Old Testament that they accept. You understand their view then and how that can't work. It's a total rearrangement of the whole Old Testament. I mean, what it amounts to is a liberal theory. They deny the inspiration of everything from Samuel through Malachi. They have to, because everything there is contrary to their own view of their history. Because you don't find the Samaritans there. You find God with all of his prophets and miracles and revelation speaking through the people of Israel and not through someone called the Samaritans. All right, then let's go up to the second view, the Jewish view. Or we could say Old Testament view as well, although the Old Testament actually has more to say than the Jewish view does. Still asking ourselves the question, who were the Samaritans? Well, simply enough, they're people from Samaria. Maybe we haven't thought of the obvious. The Samaritans are people from Samaria. But what was Samaria? Samaria was a city built by Omri, O-M-R-I, in 875 B.C. on a hill several miles. We have a picture of it here. Yeah, on a hill several miles northwest of Shechem. Here you see Samaria versus Shechem. In other words, they're very, very closely related. They're only separated geographically by a couple of miles. Samaria can be beheld from the twin mounts Ebal and Gerizim. Omri builds this around 875 B.C., a city of Samaria, on a hill, according to 1 Kings 16:24. 1 Kings 16:24 is our first reference to the city of Samaria. Listen to this. And he bought the hill Samaria. Well, now, it wasn't called that then. As you'll see in this verse, we don't know what it was called. And he bought the hill Samaria of Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of the city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria. We don't need to get into the Hebrew. It's a little complicated here, but he gives it the name Samaria. At least in the English you can see it's somewhat similar to Shemer, on the basis of the name of the owner of the hill. So first of all, he names the hill Samaria, then he names the city he builds upon the hill Samaria. However, the first occurrence of the term is actually in 1 Kings 13:32. Now, how are we going to explain this? I mean, it's being built. It's not even built until 1624. 1 Kings 16:24. But the first reference to it is 1 Kings 13 and verse 32. This was the chapter, famous chapter, dealing with the old and the young prophet. The old prophet deceived the young prophet and cost him his life. And it came to pass after he had buried him that he spake to his son, saying, When I am dead, then bury me in the sepulchre wherein the man of God is buried. Lay my bones beside his bones. For the saying which he cried by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel, and against all the houses of the high places which are in the cities of Samaria, shall surely come to pass. Well, Samaria is nothing at this time. It's not known. There's a hill that has some other name that awaits the future for Omri to come on the scene, buy the hill, name it after the owner, build a city, name it likewise. So how do we explain 1 Kings 13:32? You got any ideas? Old Testament introduction would help you. Concerning words in the Pentateuch, Moses didn't really write the Pentateuch because such and such words are found in there. Okay, it's a redaction. No question about that. 1 Kings 32, originally the prophet said something else. He couldn't have said Samaria. That's like saying, bury me in New York, before New York City, back in 1000 B.C. You couldn't say that when it doesn't exist. So he said something else. Redactor has brought it up to date, so we know whatever he said was this area of Samaria. I mean, there has to be similarity, or a redactor, obviously wouldn't change the name. So yes, that's probably a redaction, because Samaria didn't exist at that time. But notice also from this verse, it's interesting for another reason, we see something, I think, about the evolution of the term. Here, does it not mean a region? It doesn't mean a hill or a city. It means a region, which are in the cities of Samaria. Now, you're not going to have 14 cities on the same hill of Samaria, and it wouldn't make any sense if Samaria means city here, then you've got, which are in the cities of the city, Samaria. That wouldn't make any sense. So by a later time, what happens is the term evolves beyond the hill, beyond the city on the hill, to be the country around that, and eventually it becomes so broad, it includes this whole area. Well, down, I'm up too far, all the way down here up to here. The central part, in other words, of Israel, the whole area becomes known as Samaria. It all takes its name back from this first hill and city in 1 Kings 16:24. So you start with the hill, then you go to the city that's built on it, then you go to that entire region, becomes known as Samaria. Therefore, anyone from either the hill, the city, or the region would be a Samaritan. So, we think we have the answer. I know who the Samaritans are, the people born in Samaria. Well, that's like saying, if you're trying to find out who Jack Smith is, and you say, well, I know who he is. He's the son of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Well, you're not really any closer to the truth, though, are you? You still haven't really answered it. It's a similar situation, though. King Omri's capital, by the way, Omri was a king in the northern kingdom, and Samaria, by the way, becomes the capital of that kingdom. King Omri's capital lends its name to the whole country. There's a whole involved process of evolution in meaning and terminology here. Because then the name later in the Old Testament, Samaria, becomes synonymous with Israel, which means the northern kingdom. In the Old Testament, You don't have Galilee up here. You just got the north is Samaria and the south is Judah or Judea, with the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So do you see how involved this becomes in the evolution of it? You go from a hill named we don't know what, owned by Shemer, that was bought by King Omri. Then he names that hill after Shemer, moving the letters around, and calls it Samaria. Then he builds a capital city. It's a good place to build a capital city. You want to build it on a hill because it's fortified. It's a lot harder when soldiers are fighting you to climb up a hill than to go down one. You're on top shooting down at them, and they're trying to come up. So you build a city there, secondly. Then just the area around that, including down here to Shechem, Ebal, and Gerizim, becomes known as Samaria. So you've got a whole geographical region. And then that becomes synonymous with Israel, or the northern kingdom. I'll give you a couple of passages. Hosea 8:5, Amos 3:9. Especially as you get into those prophets, the minor prophets. You don't find it a lot prior to that. But when you get into the minor prophets, then Samaria becomes synonymous with Israel, the northern kingdom. Ephraim does too, for other reasons. So the 10 northern tribes, all the tribes represented by the names of the sons, with the exception of Judah and Benjamin, the 10 northern tribes become known as Samaria. Now, interestingly enough, the term Samaritan, so far all we've looked at is Samaria, the place. Samaritan would be the person. Occurs only once in all of the Old Testament. Only once in all of the Old Testament does the actual name Samaritan occur. And it's found in the most important chapter dealing with this Samaritan question, and that is 2 Kings 17. And the verse would be 29. Now, you may have to outline all of this later on your notes so you see the development of the term from one little small place to a whole entire region and finally a religious political kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel versus the southern kingdom of Judah. And interestingly enough, also, in 2 Kings 17:29, the term Samaritan here, the only place it occurs in all of the Old Testament, means exactly what we would think it would mean, people from Samaria. In other words, there is no connotation of racial mixture or religious syncretism found in 2 Kings 17:29. It's purely a geographical name. That's very important to know that. It's simply a reference to people who formerly inhabited the region called Samaria. Howbeit every nation made gods of their own and put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made. Every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. Now here's what I guess I'm trying to say. You cannot make this appearance here in 2 Kings 17:29 in the Old Testament, although it's Samaritan, you cannot make this mean what that exact same term does in the New Testament. By the time you get to the New Testament, you've got a further evolution, a further development of the term. And there you take on racial and religious overtones. Whereas in the Old Testament, the only time it appears, it's purely geographical. Now see that, but that's very easy to mistake that because you're most familiar with the Samaritans from your New Testament reading, and that represents the last form of their development, you see. You've missed all of their history. That's the last form of their development. Then it becomes tempting to read all of that back into the Old Testament occurrence of it in 2 Kings 17:29. And that's what must be avoided. Jesus talking to that woman at the well of Samaria is an entirely different situation than what you find here in 2 Kings 17:29. Here it's purely a geographical reference. It has nothing to do with with a racial or religious overtone as we find over in the New Testament. Let me cover one other aspect of the search for the Jewish Old Testament view of the Samaritans. What I've given you thus far is according to geography in the Old Testament, evolution of the term Samaria. But we see by the time we get to the New Testament that the term is used in a very different sense. The way the term most often appears, it is used in a very different, much later sense. And this is how it appears in the New Testament. And how is that? That's not a geographical or political sense. People from the northern kingdom of Israel, political. People from the region of Samaria, geographical. But an ethnic and religious one. This is the most basic change that we see. And let me give you 3 steps that lead to this development very early on. And we're going to see a lot more later. But let me give you 3 steps that lead to this development very early on that will take us eventually, now it doesn't do it overnight, it takes us eventually away from the geographical political sense to the racial religious one. Okay, 3 steps involved with that, and that may be all the time we have tonight. Number 1, in 732 BC, I still need my map in just a moment, so I better keep it up there. The Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser, 732 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser invades Israel from the northeast. Like this, from Assyria. And deports many of the people, the northern part, the region that we now would know, and they would know at that time as Samaria, deports many of the people of Samaria. This is according to 2 Kings 15:29. Now watch this verse. This is a very important verse. Sometimes you'll see his name spelled as Tilgath-Pileser, sometimes Tiglath-Pileser. It's the same thing. You just got the G and the L swapped in the first word. 2 Kings 15:29. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser. Now, you're familiar with his name by now, but if you said that in most churches, they'd think that you're speaking in tongues, maybe. But it's really a biblical word, though. King of Assyria, you're just glad that your mama didn't name you that. And took Ijon, and Abel-Beth-Maacah, and Genoa, and Kedesh. Now we're getting to names that we know. Some of these we can't identify. Some are just small places. And Hazor. Hazor's up to the north. See if we've got some of these on here. Well, Hazor's way up north. Here it is right here. See, here's Kedesh. So he's coming in from the northeast here. That's how you know it's northeast because of the names of the cities mentioned. And Galilee, which doesn't have the same name as it does in the New Testament. It's not a separate third division of Israel. And all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. Now, that's the first step that we need to note here. Now, although these are the only places mentioned as being places from which people were deported, we may assume that others were imported, since this was the Assyrian policy to take as many as possible. But certainly they don't come as far down here as Jerusalem, down at the very bottom. So there's the first step in a shift which will forever change the history of these people in the north. A first step in that is the work of Tiglath-Pileser in 732 BC. Then secondly, in 722 BC, the city of Samaria, which is the capital by this time of the northern kingdom, Remember, Omri founds this way back in 875, so we're a century and a half later now. Omri founds it in 875. Century and a half later, 722 BC, the city of Samaria falls to the Assyrians, to Sargon, who again practices the Assyrian policy of importation, deportation. I think when it's goods, it's called importing and exporting, but when it's people, it's importing and deporting. Now for this, we need 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 to 4, verses 23 and 24. Now you'll notice that we'll be in 2 Kings 17 a whole lot. This is the basic major chapter in the Old Testament, giving us the history. Let's say it another way, one link in the chain. I think that's a much better way of saying it. One link in the chain of Samaritan history. So you may want to be reading that now over the next few days in preparation for more turnings to this chapter. Verse 1, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. And against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. So he skips his payment here, and the bank's going to foreclose on him. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Verse 6, you could read, the whole section. It details from the prophetic point of view. Kings is written by a prophet, Chronicles by a priest. From the prophetic point of view, why this happened. And of course it goes into the business that Israel sinned, and there's always a relationship between obedience and blessing and disobedience and the consequences, evil ones that follow that. The 9th year of Hoshea, I'm in verse 6, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in these cities, so forth, and then basically from then on out until you get down to verses 23 and 24, you simply have an explanation for the fall of the northern kingdom, a spiritual explanation. They fell, Deuteronomy 28, predicted because of their sins. So those are the meaty verses of the chapter. They don't detail the history like the first few and last do, but they give you the spiritual reason why they fell. And not only do you have people taken out of the city, or the region in verse 6, place them in Hala and Tabor by the river, goes on the cities of the Medes. In verses 23 and 24, you've got people brought into Samaria. Now those verses are important. Verse 6 and verse 24 have to be read together. Now you say, well, we keep coming across the name of Shalmaneser here. Well, in the Assyrian writings, the so-called Annals of Sargon, which I gave you last time as one of the important sources of information for Samaritan history, the Annals of Sargon, and the Old Testament does too, and I've already shown this to you years ago in OT Intro, so I don't want to do that again, inform us that Sargon was actually the one who took the city. Shalmaneser began the siege, he died halfway through, and Sargon was the one who finished it. Some of you are shaking your head. You evidently remember that then. Shalmaneser begins, he dies, Sargon takes it. The Old Testament shows that very clearly with a little shift in pronouns. We won't get into that. That's on an earlier tape. Sargon initially takes 27,290 people. Now that's not told to us in the Old Testament. That's from Sargon's Annals. 27,290. From a population that one Old Testament scholar estimates at about 600,000. So this would represent the leading citizens, 27,290 of the region of Samaria. And then quickly, let me give you one third and final step in the early link in this chain. Shortly after this, during the first half of the 7th century BC, At least 2 other Assyrian kings practiced the same procedure and policy of importation, deportation. Namely, Sargon's grandson, Esarhaddon, in Ezra 4:2, with Isaiah 7:8, and his great-grandson, Ashurbanipal, in Ezra 4:10.